The wind across Arizona carried the scent of dust and regret, curling through the canyons like a ghost that refused to die. Jacob Hale rode slow, the reins loose in his sunburnt hands, his hat tilted low against the fading gold of dusk. The auction had ended hours ago, but the sound of the gavel still echoed in his ears like a gunshot. He hadn't gone there to buy a person, not anymore. Not in this world where the frontier still bled between law and wilderness. Yet something in him moved when he saw her standing in that wooden pen, chained but unbroken, her eyes dark as the storm behind the mountains. She was Apache, maybe 25, with the kind of stillness that made a man feel seen and judged all at once. When the auctioneer shouted her number, Jacob's hand raised without thought, like his guilt had taken its own form. Now she sat behind him on the horse, silent, wrapped in a torn blanket. The desert stretched endless ahead, an ocean of dying light and bones. Jacob told himself he'd free her, that he was doing something good, but when she spoke for the first time, her voice cut through him like barbed wire. "You think you bought me," she said softly, "but I was already taken long before this day." He turned to meet her gaze, and that's when he saw it, the faint scar beneath her shoulder, dark and twisted against her skin. It looked like a tattoo at first, maybe a tribal mark, until he leaned closer and realized it was something crueler, branded by fire, still carrying the scent of old pain. "What is that?" he asked, his voice dry as the wind. She looked at him, steady and calm, and said the words that would haunt him forever. "It's not a tattoo. It's a brand from the auction." The world seemed to stop. Jacob's breath caught in his throat as his horse slowed, hooves dragging in the sand. He felt his stomach twist, his chest tighten with something deeper than shame, a sickness that had no cure. The woman looked forward again, the wind lifting her hair as if to remind him she was more than what they had done to her. The sun sank below the cliffs, painting the sky in blood and amber. Jacob couldn't speak. He wanted to tear his own hands apart, to dig up the sins buried beneath every ranch, every fence post, every deed signed in this cursed land. He thought of his father, a man who'd built his fortune on labor and lies, and how Jacob had promised to be better, yet here he was, carrying another scarred soul home, like a relic of all he hated. The silence grew heavier until even the desert seemed to hold its breath. Finally, he said, almost to himself, "I didn't know." She didn't answer, but a single tear slid down her cheek, catching the dying light before falling to the dust. That night, when they reached the ranch, Jacob couldn't sleep. He sat on the porch, staring at the stars through the drifting smoke of his lantern, while in the cabin behind him, the woman sang a low, haunting melody in her language, a song older than the fences that cut the earth apart. And for the first time in his life, Jacob Hale felt the weight of what it meant to own anything at all. The old ranch stood like a wounded beast against the horizon, its adobe walls cracked by heat and time, whispering secrets of men who thought the land could be tamed. Jacob Hale dismounted first, his boots crunching over dry soil, the wooden porch sighing beneath his weight. The woman followed in silence, the brand on her shoulder hidden beneath her shawl, though Jacob could still feel its presence, burning in his memory like a confession. The air was heavy with the scent of rain that never came. Thunder rolled far away, teasing the desert, but never blessing it. Inside, The hacienda felt haunted, not by ghosts in the way of children's stories, but by the residue of guilt and cruelty that clung to every nail and beam. There were old photographs on the wall. Jacob's father, with the first ranch hands, faces proud, eyes hollow. He poured her water, set bread on the table, and spoke with a gentleness that felt strange on his tongue. "You can rest here," he said, but she didn't sit. Her gaze wandered the room like she was tracing the invisible hands of the past. "You people build homes over graves," she murmured, her voice low, almost kind. "And then you wonder why your nights are haunted." Jacob wanted to argue, to tell her he wasn't like the others, but the truth knotted his throat. He was their blood, their heir. The walls knew it, even if she didn't. Later that night, when the desert wind screamed through the mesquite, he found her standing outside, barefoot in the dust, staring at the moon as if she were speaking to someone beyond it. "Who are you talking to?" he asked softly. "My mother," she said. "She was taken when I was 10. They burned our village so the railroad could pass. I sing so she knows I'm still alive." Jacob's heart stung. He wanted to say sorry, but the word was useless, a broken coin in a market where pain was priceless. He stepped closer, unsure if he had the right, and she didn't move away. "They branded me so no one would forget," she said, touching her shoulder. "But it's not the fire that hurts. It's that they watched and called it business." Her voice trembled only at the edge, like a blade catching light. Jacob felt the storm coming closer, flashes of lightning exposing the valley in brief, violent beauty. "I can't change what happened," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "but I can choose what happens next." She looked at him then, really looked, and in her eyes was not forgiveness, but recognition, as though she saw the same scar on his soul. The thunder cracked overhead, the ranch shuddered. Rain finally began to fall, tapping softly against the tin roof, running down the wooden posts like tears from the sky. For a moment, it felt as though the desert was washing something away, though neither knew if it was enough. She turned and walked inside, leaving Jacob standing in the rain, staring at the horizon where dawn would come too soon. He knew then that he hadn't rescued her. She was the one who might yet rescue him, if redemption was still possible for men like him. Inside, the fire flickered weakly, and her song began again, carrying through the rooms a prayer, a warning, and a promise that the ghosts of the hacienda would not sleep until the truth was named. Days turned into weeks, and the ranch began to breathe differently, as if it too could sense that something sacred or dangerous had entered its soil. Jacob Hale worked the fields with his sleeves rolled up, his hands blistered, not from labor, but from trying to unlearn the comfort of command. Tessa never stayed still for long. She moved through the land like she belonged to it, her bare feet stirring dust that seemed to recognize her. The cattle grew restless at her presence, but the land grew calm, the wells less dry, the wind softer. Jacob noticed things he'd never cared to before, how the river behind the house carried more red clay than water, as if it remembered the blood of centuries past. He watched her one morning as she knelt beside that river, dipping her hands into the dirt-stained current, whispering words in her mother's tongue. He didn't interrupt. He just listened to the rhythm of her prayer, which felt older than the ranch itself. That night, they sat by the fire, the smell of burning mesquite wrapping around them. Tessa spoke first. You think this land is yours because you paid for it, she said. But the ground doesn't care who writes their name on paper. It remembers footsteps. It remembers screams. Jacob looked into the flames, feeling their heat but no comfort. Then teach me, he said quietly. Teach me to see it the way you do. She looked at him, half surprised, half pitying. You can't learn what you took, she said, but maybe you can learn how to return it. A silence followed, heavy but not cruel. The wind outside howled again, and the boards creaked like old bones. Somewhere in the distance, coyotes cried out, their voices blending with the hum of the storm building on the horizon. Later that night, as Jacob tried to sleep, he dreamed of the auction of his father, of a line of chained men and women walking into the desert until they vanished into the sand. When he woke, his chest was damp with sweat, and Tessa was gone. Panic rose in him like a fever. He grabbed his coat and lantern, calling her name into the dark. He found her at the river again, barefoot and trembling, her hands covered in red clay. "What are you doing?" he shouted, his voice cracking with fear. She turned, her face streaked with tears and rain, and whispered, "I'm giving it back." He looked down and saw what she'd unearthed: bones, half buried in the mud, small and fragile, like those of a child. The river had hidden its dead. Jacob fell to his knees beside her, unable to breathe. "They buried them here," she said, her voice breaking. "The ones they took, the ones no one claimed." Lightning split the sky open, illuminating the horror beneath their feet, dozens of shapes, lost beneath years of silt. Jacob's throat tightened as if the land itself were choking him. "We'll bury them, right?" he said finally. "We'll give them names, even if we don't know them." Tessa looked at him, the rain washing the clay from her hands. "You can't name the dead," she said softly. "You can only stop making more of them." The storm raged through the night, and as they stood there, the rancher and the branded woman, the river turned red once more, not from blood, but from the earth, remembering what it had always known. For 3 days the storm lingered, as if the heavens themselves refused to leave until the truth beneath the ranch was unearthed. The air smelled of wet dust and sorrow. The land had opened its wounds, and now it demanded something in return. Jacob Hale had not spoken much since that night by the river. He moved like a man caught between two worlds, one of guilt and one of awakening. Tessa watched him from a distance, her face unreadable, her silence both a comfort and a mirror. The graves they had uncovered became mounds of fresh earth behind the barn, marked with stones. Jacob placed himself. He built a small wooden cross for each, though he knew not their names. "You don't need crosses," Tessa had said. "The land remembers them without your symbols." But he built them anyway, not for them, but for himself, for the man he had been when he thought land and people could be owned the same way. On the 4th day, the sky cleared. The desert shimmered gold again, but it was no longer the same desert. The ground felt alive beneath his boots, restless, whispering. That evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, Jacob found Tessa on the ridge overlooking the valley. She was sitting cross-legged, eyes closed, chanting in a low, rhythmic hum. "What are you saying?" he asked quietly. She opened her eyes and said, "A promise." Her gaze met his, calm, steady, unflinching. "This place is cursed, Jacob, not by spirits, but by memory. The only way to end it is to burn what was built on the bones." His stomach tightened. You mean the ranch? She nodded slowly. Your father's house, the one that fed on their pain. Let it burn, and maybe the wind will finally sleep. He looked back at the house, its old wood, its photographs, its ghosts, and for a moment he saw it as she did, a monument to theft disguised as heritage. He felt the weight of generations pressing down on him like a hand on his throat. If I burn it, he said, there'll be nothing left. Then you'll finally be free, she replied. As dusk fell, Jacob gathered what little he owned, a worn Bible, his father's watch, a bottle of whiskey, and carried them inside. The house groaned around him, each floorboard a memory. He lit the lamp, then another, until the walls flickered with light. His hands shook as he uncorked the bottle and poured it along the wooden beams. Tessa stood at the doorway, silent as the desert wind. You sure? He asked, voice breaking. She said nothing, only nodded once. Jacob struck a match. The flame caught like it had been waiting years for this moment. Fire spread along the walls, swallowing portraits, curtains, the ghosts of a dynasty built on bones. Smoke rose into the twilight, curling around the stars. The house wailed as it collapsed in on itself, the sound more human than wood should make. Jacob stood beside Tessa, the reflection of the blaze dancing in their eyes. Now it's gone, he whispered. Now it begins, she answered. The fire roared, devouring history, purifying and punishing at once. When it was done, the ranch was nothing but ash and the faint smell of rain. The horizon glowed faintly, like dawn after a long, dark century. Tessa reached down, took a handful of ash, and let it fall between her fingers. It's lighter now, she said softly. And Jacob, for the first time, felt it too, the air, the land, and maybe even his soul. The fire burned until dawn, until every trace of the old ranch was reduced to ash and silence. Jacob Hale stood where the house once was, boots sunk into the blackened earth, the air still warm with the breath of ghosts. The sun was only a pale promise at the edge of the desert, stretching timid fingers of light through the smoke. Beside him, Tessa was quiet, the shawl around her shoulders tattered, her face streaked with soot, her eyes reflecting the colors of the new day. For a long while, neither spoke. The world felt cleansed but fragile, like a wound that had finally been washed yet still throbbed with memory. Jacob reached down, lifted a handful of ash, and let it fall through his fingers, the dust carried off by the morning wind. So this is what freedom feels like, he said softly, though it sounded more like a prayer than a statement. Tessa looked toward the rising sun. Freedom isn't light, she said. It's knowing you can stand in the dark and still not bow. Her voice carried through the open valley, echoing faintly between the rocks. The cattle had scattered, the fences had burned, even the windmill had collapsed. Everything his family had built over 3 generations was gone, and yet Jacob didn't feel empty. He felt small. Small in the way that truth makes a man small, humbled before something older and wilder than his bloodline. He turned to her. What happens now? She didn't answer at first. Instead, she knelt, tracing symbols in the soot with her fingertips, circles, lines, patterns that glowed faintly in the amber light. My people used to bless the ground after death, she said, not to forget, but to remember in peace. Jacob watched her hands move, graceful and sure, like she was sewing the earth back together. When she finished, she looked up and said, You can rebuild, not the house, but yourself. He nodded slowly, the truth of it sinking deep. Will you stay? He asked, though he already knew the answer. Tessa smiled, but it was the kind of smile that carries a goodbye inside it. The land doesn't belong to anyone, she said, but it lets us pass through if we listen. She walked toward the ridge where the mountains met the sky, her figure shrinking against the vast morning. Jacob wanted to call after her, but the words died on his tongue. Instead, he watched as she raised her hand once, in farewell or in blessing, and disappeared into the gold horizon. The wind picked up again, scattering ashes across the valley. And for a brief, miraculous moment, Jacob thought he saw faces in the dust, men, women, children, not accusing, not mourning, but smiling. The ghosts had finally rested. The desert shimmered under the newborn sun, and the air smelled faintly of rain and mesquite. Jacob turned his gaze east, where the light broke through the last remnants of smoke. He walked down to the river, now calm and silver, and knelt beside it. His reflection looked older, leaner, freer. He reached into the water, splashed it on his face, and whispered, "I will not forget." The river carried his voice downstream, gentle and sure. Behind him, the ashes stirred once more, not from wind, but from breath. The land had forgiven him, or perhaps simply moved on. And as the sun rose higher, painting everything in gold and fire, Jacob Hale, the rancher who once bought a soul and found his own instead, stood in silence and watched the world begin again.